Good morning. My name is Susan Landry, and I'm with the New York State Department of State, and welcome to the Decarbonization 101 webinar for DRI and New York Forward projects. This webinar is intended for projects that may potentially submit a project through the open call for projects requesting DRI or New York Forward funds. The webinar will be an introduction to some decarbonization strategies for buildings and considerations you may want to make as projects go through development process. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the process, so we'll ask attendees to raise their hands and we'll unmute. But if you have any questions during the presentations, feel free to leave them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Michael, who will be leading the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. I am Michael Goodrum with Noresco, and we are a consultant supporting the decarbonization program within the DRI and New York Forward programs. And as Susan said, we'll go through today an overview of decarbonization, a brief agenda. We'll start with just some background on decarbonization. We'll briefly go over some very basic decarbonization compliance information, and then talk through, how do we get there for decarbonization? Where are we focusing? And then some various strategies and basic economics info for projects. And then come back to the decarbonization compliance within the DRI New York Forward programs, just thinking about, which upgrades would make sense, and have some time for questions at the end. Getting started, some key terms to think about as we were talking about decarbonization. First, some of these I think people are probably familiar with, but gases that trap heat in the atmosphere are called greenhouse gases, or now often they're sort of considered carbon emissions, and decarbonization is basically reducing carbon emissions. When we start talking about building decarbonization, that's looking at mitigating those carbon emissions through reducing building energy demand and converting existing equipment to highly efficient systems. And that's especially fossil fuel equipment. And that gets us to building electrification, which is shifting from using fossil fuels for heating and cooking to using electricity, primarily talking about building systems. And another term in here, greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with, producing and transporting and the, maintenance disposal of different building systems and materials as embodied carbon. A carbon neutral building is something NYSERDA has some programs for and talks about, and that's one where the design and construction and operation of the building don't contribute emissions to or greenhouse gas emissions. And the last term in here, maybe moving kind of beyond decarbonization, resilient buildings, and those are buildings that are designed to keep occupants safe, healthy, comfortable, especially during extreme events, power outages, things like that, which is becoming a more important consideration. And in most cases, decarbonization measures and approaches can help make a building more resilient. A little bit of background on decarbonization in New York. So the state of New York passed the Climate Leadership Act, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which sets a goal of reducing carbon emissions by 85% by 2050. And you can see from the graphic on the left there that about 60% of emissions come from buildings and transportation, and you can see a big chunk of that is buildings. There are like 6.2 million buildings in New York. That's probably even a low number now. It's probably gone up since then. So here within DRI, we're really focusing on decarbonization for buildings because they make up a really big chunk of the emissions for the state and are a big part of achieving the state's climate goals. Some of the benefits for decarbonization, one of the first to talk about are utility costs and savings. I've broken it out into two pieces. One is energy efficiency. And, so moving to more efficient systems means that you're using less energy for the same, amount of light or amount of heat or whatever, which means that from an energy cost standpoint, your cost should go down for that amount of heat or whatnot. Now, obviously, rates change, things like that, that can cause fluctuations, but you're still using less and should be paying less than you would with a less efficient system. For electrification, it's not always as straightforward. We just said building electrification, you're moving from fossil fuel to electric. It means that you're reducing or even eliminating your fossil fuel utility costs, but it means you're also increasing your electricity costs. Depending on what the rates are, that may or may not mean an overall savings in your energy costs. So, that kind of depends, but, over time, fossil fuel costs may increase. You probably will see savings there, but it's not always a guarantee. So something to keep in mind. Other benefits, there are a variety. We were just talking about the cost. Like there's an expectation that fossil fuels are limited and that over time they may become more expensive. So shifting to electricity, especially where you can have renewable sources, the electricity cost may be more stable over time. There are health benefits for indoor air quality. We talked about resilience and that, things like weatherization and solar and energy storage can help a building stay more comfortable and operate longer during like a power outage, things like that. So there are many, many benefits to decarbonization for building projects. Now we'll give just some quick overview of the decarbonization compliance within the DRI and New York Forward programs. Basically, here, this is just kind of a matrix of who would need to comply or who'd be required. Projects that are over 5,000 square feet. So whether they're new buildings or building additions or substantial renovations, they'd be required. And then those that are under 5,000 square feet or, maybe don't meet the definition of substantial renovation, they'd be encouraged to opt in. We won't go into too much detail on this. We will be holding community meetings to go into more details on the actual decarbonization compliance within the program. Right now, we're really just going to give a quick overview. So those are kind of the basic criteria for who would be required. And then we have 3 compliance paths outlined for decarbonization within the program. The first being meeting the New York Stretch Code. It's basically 10% more efficient than the state's just base energy code. You can meet it in 2 different ways, prescriptive or performance. So that's the first path. The second is to achieve an Energy Star score of 90 or better using EPA's Target Finder software, basically predicting how the building's going to operate, because these are all new projects, even if it's a renovation, it's not going to operate the same as it has in the past. So achieving that score. And the third is via third-party certifications. You've got a list here of a variety of different accepted certifications. Some examples. NYSERDA's Building Cleaner Communities Challenge. We've had some projects in past rounds that have been awarded that. Others that people are familiar with. LEED is pretty common. WELL is another common one. So achieving those certifications or pursuing those certifications is third compliance path. Now, thinking about how we get there within DRI, we showed the slide earlier with the contributions from buildings and transportation, which are all areas that these projects impact. For new buildings, it's making them more efficient, adding in like clean energy sources, making electrification solutions, things like that. Existing buildings, obviously retrofitting them to be more efficient and to include clean energy sources or even electrification, things like that. Transportation projects, some of the projects here are, reducing vehicle miles driven, providing like charging for EV, other alternative fuels or modes of transportation can also have impacts. Now, like I said, we're focusing really on buildings for decarbonization within the DRI New York Forward programs. So thinking specifically about buildings, if you've got new buildings, having a mindset of integrated design and really bringing all of the team members together at the beginning to talk about what your goals are and, outlining what they will be and then building that into the design from the beginning. And a lot of that is just to avoid having to come back and do redesign later. It can, streamline your schedule and also help with, reducing your costs by not having to go back and redesign. For existing buildings, it's thinking about constructability and really, you're backfitting into an existing building, into existing systems, and making sure that things are going to work correctly, that they're going to fit, they're not too big or not too heavy or whatever. Also minimizing disruptions to the occupants, right? In most cases, you're wanting to continue to operate the building while you're doing the construction. So trying to figure out good ways to do that. So doing your due diligence to have a good design and make sure that it'll work for those things, and then building in contingencies because things happen and don't always go the way that you would expect them to. Now, this is kind of a basic path or framework for decarbonization within a building. Now, it's not a hard, fast, like you can't do number 3 if you haven't done number 2 or something like that. But it's just a way to think about approaching decarbonization. And this can apply for new buildings and also for existing. So you're starting with reducing your loads in the building and then maximizing efficiency of systems before you move toward electrification, especially where you're talking about like an existing building retrofit, because then you can better size your electrification, your heat pump system, say, which can save you some money on first costs and kind of long term. And then, taking advantage of building automation systems and controls to further optimize, and then adding in distributed energy, renewable energy, and eventually energy storage. And then the last one is embodied carbon. We're not really touching on that with the requirements we have for decarbonization in DRI, but that's another consideration to bring in on your path for decarbonization. Now, with a building project and looking at decarbonization, especially for existing buildings, your first step is understanding how that building is using energy now, and that can really start with an energy audit or a decarbonization assessment to help just identify the conditions and the systems in the building and how it's using energy. And then from there, moving to a building energy model to help you evaluate some different options, right? And solutions that you could have. And so taking the results from the energy audit and the information you collected to make sure you have a good model that actually represents how the building uses energy. And then from there, using that to do some cost benefit analysis for different potential strategies or measures, and figuring out, which might be the best for that particular building and for your project. And now we'll spend some time going over a variety of different strategies that you can use for decarbonization in a building. Following sort of the path we laid out before, starting with some load reduction and some energy efficiency, and then building electrification strategies, controls, and then distributed energy and storage to round it out. As far as load reduction, this can be electric loads and can also be heating and cooling loads. They're both important and play a role in the decarbonization of the building. So we'll talk through some various ones, beginning with building envelope. So high performance building envelopes, there are a variety of strategies that can be used I've got some examples here, some common ones. So, adding insulation and then also addressing what's known as thermal bridging. Basically, in a building where you have the studs, like you'll have insulation between, but then more heat can escape or be transferred through the studs because they're not insulated. And so coming up with ways, some of that can be like exterior insulation panels, stuff like that, where you basically have continuous insulation on the building. Looking at like window replacements or even just shading and films to help with reducing like solar heat gain from windows and stuff. And then weatherization and other air sealing so that you're not leaking your either warm or cool air outside when you want it to stay in the building. That's a really good way to save energy and reduce your energy use and emissions. And then cool roofs. I know for New York, a lot of the communities are in cooler climates, and so the thought is, well, maybe cool roofs wouldn't be great because you'd want the heat in the winter. There have been some studies that have shown, even in cooler climates, that it still overall saves energy to have cool roofs. Like they had a study, I think it was done in Minnesota, and it showed that over the course of the year, you still saw energy savings from a cool roof. Next, lighting, really LED lighting. I think it's pretty common at this point. And, replacing whatever lighting you have with LED so it's more efficient. And then adding in various lighting controls like occupancy controls or lighting scheduling. That's even better than being more efficient, right? Just turning it off when nobody's there. Another really powerful thing for lighting are day lighting or skylights, where you can turn lights off during the day because you've got natural light coming in from outside. So those are all some very good strategies for buildings, and lighting in particular is usually a pretty low cost retrofit, like for an existing building, that can save you quite a bit. And can also help reduce the electric load to make space for heat pumps, and we'll get into that later. But another, talking about reducing electric load, are smart building systems for like plug load controls, various things. You see here vending machines, computers, things like that. But turning them off when they're not needed is another way to save some energy, save some electricity, and reduce your electric demand. And then ventilation strategies for heating and cooling loads. That can be a really big part as you move toward electrification and thinking about heat pumps. So, first steps are reducing the amount of outside air you're bringing in. There, a whole bunch of different strategies we have here, like, ASHRAE 62.1, 62.2, and like demand controlled ventilation, things like that. They're really all getting at reducing how much outside air you need just to meet the number of people that are in the space, and not bringing in more than is necessary, because then you have to heat it or cool it. And also, taking advantage of like natural ventilation and, even using like circulating fans and stuff to move the air around can be some ways to reduce the amount of conditioned air that you need to use for a space. And also reducing losses through ductwork. So we talked about the weatherization for the building and, not leaking air outside. The same is true for the ductwork. A lot of ductwork is run in spaces like, attics and whatever that's not conditioned. And if you have big leaks there, then you're essentially throwing that away. You're conditioning, the attic space instead of the place where all the people are. So sealing up ducts and insulating it can be a really good way to reduce the heating and cooling loads that you have for the building. Another is through energy recovery ventilation. And really, it sounds complicated. It's basically just transferring heat, so say in the wintertime when you're heating the building and then you bring cold air in from outside, capturing some of the heat from the warm air in the building and transferring it to the cold air as you bring it in, rather than having to heat it up from whatever temperature it is. Same in the summer, you can do it the other way. But taking advantage of that, and you can even do that for like hot water systems and stuff, and use it to heat air and whatnot. But you can just be creative. There are a variety of things, and some of the projects we've seen in DRI have had things like microbreweries and whatnot, which put off a lot of heat. So in the wintertime, they can be a great source of heat. And instead of having to like heat it with your heat pump or your furnace or something, maybe you can move the air from that space to the place where all the people are, or something like that. So it's a great way to reduce the amount of mechanical heating and cooling you need, and just take advantage of what's already there. Another one, domestic hot water systems, they get overlooked a lot. It can be a pretty big use, especially in like multifamily buildings. And so, paying attention to ways to reduce your hot water load. And, that can be as easy as just lowering the temperature and, putting it at 120 instead of 140. Also installing high efficiency like shower heads, faucets, things like that, that just reduce the amount of water so that you're producing less hot water and have less of a hot water load. You can also do heat recovery with water. That's a little more complicated, but you can like recover heat from a warm shower to heat up the incoming water or something like that. And then similar to the ductwork, insulating things so that you're not losing heat from pipes or from your hot water tanks and stuff like that can help save energy in a domestic hot water system. And then maximizing efficiency is another piece. Here highlighting retro commissioning or recommissioning as some key ways to do that. Basically, they both are achieving the same thing, which is essentially tuning up the building and the systems to make sure that they're working as efficiently as they can. Retro commissioning is going in and commissioning a system that never was in the first place, right? So maybe it got installed, nobody ever commissioned and made sure it worked like it was designed to, and it's been 10 years, and now you go back and actually tune it up and make sure it works the way it was meant to from the beginning. Recommissioning, would be something that has been commissioned, but it's kind of been ignored over time, and it's not working as well as it should anymore. And you, like I said, do kind of a tune-up on it and make sure that it's operating the way that it was originally designed to and did at the beginning. And so, doing those things are a lot of times can be pretty low cost. They can be pretty easy things to adjust and help make sure that systems are working efficiently. Then we move to strategies for building electrification. And a first consideration for building electrification is the electrical capacity. This is really for existing buildings where you'd be doing retrofits. If you are converting from a fossil fuel system to an electric, and especially in some of the older, like historic buildings and things we see in DRI, New York Ford, the old service may not be sufficient, right? Or your panel capacity may not be sufficient to add in a heat pump or heat pump water heater, things like that. So as you're doing the energy audit and assessment piece, making sure that included in that is an assessment of the electrical system to make sure that you have the capacity that's needed and can operate the equipment you're planning to without having to make service upgrades, things like that. Or if you find that you need them, then building that cost and time into your project. Another important consideration in an existing building with installing heat pumps are the hot water temperatures. So if you have a system that runs on heating hot water from like a boiler now, it's probably operating at a much higher temperature than a heat pump will, and making sure that you can still operate the building and keep it hot or warm enough for occupants with a heat pump. And so there are a variety of different strategies. I've noted some here. You can look at ways to adjust the system to operate with lower temperatures, which can even mean like putting in new coils, stuff like that. They do make like high temperature heat pumps now. They cost more than a conventional one, but they do exist. Or there's some other ways to like combine heat pumps together in a cascading system, they call it, to get a higher temperature out, or even just adding in fossil fuel boilers as a supplement for like peak days, things like that. But it's an important consideration. It's not as simple as, oh, let's just put in a heat pump instead of the boiler and we're good. Especially for a lot of the buildings and projects in New York, you've got systems that are going to have been operating, it's probably about 180 degrees, and a lot of heat pumps are like 120, maybe 140. So something to definitely think about and have looked at as part of an energy audit or a decarbonization assessment. As far as heat pumps go, I think heat pumps are familiar to people now, but they basically move heat from one place to another. So they move it from the indoors to the outside during the summer to cool the space, and then they move it from outside to inside during the winter to heat. There are a variety of different heat pumps that exist. Air source heat pumps, variable refrigerant flow, or VRF, which usually are a type of an air source heat pump. Those are systems that can work well for some retrofits because they have some more flexibility in where you can place equipment and can fit in some tighter spaces. Water source heat pumps and then ground source heat pumps are kind of a form of water source heat pump. Air source heat pumps, in New York and in colder climates, there are, I know there's probably some concerns that you wouldn't be able to provide enough heating. They do make cold climate heat pumps and are starting to really provide more and more options in that space that can operate, well into like -5 degrees and all. So they do have solutions there for cold climates. At the same time, water source or ground source heat pumps can be really good alternatives because they're operating with a water loop that's at a more constant temperature, and you're not really affected by what the temperature is outside. So those are some good solutions. For cold climate heat pumps, Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, or NEEP, has some like a whole cold climate heat pump database. Maybe when we send the slides around, we can send the link for that as well. Another heat pump water heaters. For most of the projects we're talking about here, it's probably something like what's shown in the picture, where it's like an integrated heat pump and storage tank like you'd see with what you're used to in like a residential water heater. And a lot of these now are made for 120 volt outlets, which makes them a lot easier to retrofit. So, it's basically just using a heat pump to heat the water. Some things to think about there is with these, you need a proper amount of ventilation. The manufacturer will specify, and that's because it's pulling in the air from the surrounding space to run the heat pump. So you need to make sure you actually do have that space and that proper ventilation. You may even need to look at it will eventually cool the space it's in. So, you may need to think about that. And if you're going to like overcool the room, which can actually lead to it not performing as well. So there's some considerations, but they do make a good source for water heating and are a very efficient form for hot water. Others are like electric appliances, like induction cooktops or heat pump dryers, things like that you can install. And, that's probably a multifamily consideration, but, there are ways to move toward electric for those appliances. And last, we don't have too many projects in DRI New York Forward that are, like multiple buildings or things like that. But, where you do have some where you've got a couple of buildings looking at, thermal loops, which, would primarily be something like ground source heat pumps that are serving multiple buildings. We do have a project in round 5 that's looking at that. So it is an option, or, like if you have like a campus or something like that. I know I've seen some small towns that have even looked at it for like their town centers, stuff like that. So they can be an interesting option. The thing with ground source heat pumps they are expensive because of the drilling and all that. So it's something to really evaluate before you just, dive into ground source heat pumps, but it can be a really good option and a good, very efficient source of heating and cooling. Then moving to advanced controls, and taking advantage of controls, really, a combination of turning things on and off on a schedule or setting temperatures and all that, but then also looking at load flexibility or what's being, I maybe seen called grid interactivity. So, one option is monitoring based commissioning. Oh, sorry, my slide title is out of date. Monitoring based commissioning. We talked about the others like retro commissioning, recommissioning before, and monitoring based commissioning basically is somebody is continuing to commission it over time and you're watching the system and continuing to tweak it and optimize it and make sure it operates or continues to operate the way it was designed and kind of optimally, so that you continue to save energy and even making improvements, right? As you see, learn things about how the building operates and works. So that one is a good option. And then load flexibility and advanced controls or grid interactivity. Building in advanced controls, one, just to do like scheduling, and you can do schedule optimization where not only does it say, okay, I know to turn on at 6 a.m. and turn off at 6 p.m., but look at what the temperature is outside and the data for the building of how long it's taken to heat up or cool down, and then say, well, I know that because of the temperature outside and how long it takes to heat and cool this building, that I don't have to start at 6 a.m. I could start at 6:15 and still, get there. And so it'll adjust it, and, kind of smart over time. Others are like resetting temperatures or pressures, things like that. Even ventilation, we had talked about that with some of the ventilation strategies before. But the last one, demand response, that's getting into what is like the grid interactive or load flexibility, and that's where you start to respond to either utility prices or other factors to adjust how you're using energy. So it might be that you turn off the hot water heater during a high electricity period, or things like that. So a good example would be, I think a lot of people are familiar with like a Nest thermostat, and a lot of them now are set up where they can talk to your utility and they might adjust the temperature in the building so that, by like 1 or 2 degrees, so that you're not using as much energy when electricity costs are highest, things like that. So, it's taking advantage of the technology and making sure, or, making adjustments so that you can reduce your overall utility costs and your energy use for the building. And our last category, distributed energy resources and storage. I think a lot of people are familiar with renewable energy and, may have heard of like battery storage and some of that. So we'll talk through some of those strategies here. The first being renewable energy. Solar PV is probably the most common and most familiar, and also probably the easiest to incorporate into most buildings, whether it's on the roof or like you see here with like a carport or something like that, parking structure. But including solar provides a clean energy source on site that you can use and take advantage of to help, one, offset some of your utility costs, but even offset some of the emissions. If you're using clean energy sources in place of, whatever the local grid emissions are. Now, obviously, as the state of New York improves their grid and makes it cleaner, that changes over time, but still is a good solution and good addition for buildings for decarbonization, especially to, we talked about the carbon neutral building, right? This is part of the way of getting to carbon neutral is after you've done all those other things we've talked about, you can add solar to, offset the energy use you have with clean sources. And then battery storage is a good technology to pair with renewable systems as a way to store the energy. So for example, solar panels, you probably have highest production in the middle of the afternoon, but that may not be the time when you need most of the electricity. And so you could save and store the excess electricity you produced and use it, at night, or use it in the morning, when you are trying to warm the building back up or whatever. Um, so it, increases the flexibility, and also we talked about resiliency, right? Can increase the resiliency for a building, especially if you have something like solar panels. And if you had a power outage, you could rely on your solar panels and your battery storage to, at least operate the primary systems for the building for a while. Something to consider for battery storage are noise levels. That is really going to depend on local ordinances and whatnot, but the batteries themselves don't make a lot of noise, but you got to cool all of it, and so it's all the fans and all the other equipment. They can actually be pretty noisy, and so if you were thinking about it, you just want to check and make sure that you're not going to have issues with some kind of noise ordinance or something like that if you wanted to install a battery storage system. Another option are bidirectional charging for electric vehicles. This is probably easiest for somebody that has in like a fleet of vehicles, or like if you had an office and you had like a core set of employees that were always there and could make an agreement for doing bidirectional. But it's basically taking advantage of electric vehicles to use as a form of battery storage. So they come in, they plug into the charger, and yes, you can charge the car, but you also have it set up in a way that you could actually pull power from the batteries from those vehicles to power systems within the building. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that just for like an everyday use, somebody from the public parking their car. But if you have something set up where you have, like I said, a fleet, or had some consistent vehicles and people that agreed, it can be an option. And there have been a few of these. I know I saw a study in the city of Boulder where they saved, I think it was like 3 or 4% on their energy use for like a rec center over the span of a year, having installed, it was like 3 or 4 bidirectional chargers. So it's a strategy and something you could consider, a little more innovative than some of the other things. And then the last one is thermal storage. Thermal storage can be really useful together with heat pumps and some of the electrification solutions, especially helping to either shift the load or shave the load. And so what that means, shifting the load is if you have some peak periods where you need a lot of energy to like heat up or cool down the building or something, and it's all at the time that the utility costs are highest, that you could come up with ways with a storage system to produce like hot water or cold water at a time when the utility costs are low, and then just pump it out of the tank to meet that big peak load for your building at the time when it's high. And so you're running like 1 or 2 pumps instead of all the other HVAC equipment. Shaving it means that at those peak times that maybe you're running your HVAC system, but you also have a tank and you can supplement with that. And so instead of the HVAC system having to meet like the entire load, it can meet like 75% of it, which can also mean you can buy a smaller system, say, or what. So it can be a really powerful strategy, I would say, if you are considering thermal storage. It involves quite a bit of engineering design, so you should definitely bring in a professional that is familiar with thermal storage systems, and could design one that will work well and can overall reduce your energy costs, reduce your emissions, and help maintain the building at a comfortable temperature. And, we talked about the resiliency and all before, similar to the battery storage, right? The thermal storage can be another way. Obviously, if the power went out and you can't charge up the tank, it has like a limited capacity, but it still means that you could, maybe make use of the tank to keep things comfortable for longer. So that's another good strategy, and can be really effective when combined with various like heat pumps or electrification strategies. Some brief economics information, some basic savings for some of the strategies that we've talked about. These are all shown in percentages. They're not really dollars. There's so many things that impact the cost, like size of building, type of system, all that. But these are basics from data for the state of New York, and can be pretty representative ideas. You're thinking about decarbonization for your projects, and starting to build out what that looks like and what budgets might be. We've got all the strategies here, and some of them you've got combinations, right? So you've got individuals, like if you just do lighting or just do insulation, and then you can see, okay, if I combine lighting and a heat pump, or lighting and a heat pump and insulation, the effects and the savings that you can achieve, which can be pretty substantial when you start to combine it all together. We also have some basic cost information here for some of these systems, just to, again, help with estimating. Obviously, for costs, you'd want to get quotes from contractors in your area to get real pricing, but this just helps give you kind of a ballpark idea for some of these different strategies we've talked about. What kind of costs, and these are like added costs, right? So it's like above and beyond what you would have been doing anyway. And I think there was a question I thought I saw pop up in the chat that, yes, these slides will be shared, so you don't need to like try and screenshot it real quick. You'll get a PDF copy of the slides. And, I alluded to this on the slide with the savings, but talking about the combined impacts, and, what it looks like, and, what kind of reductions you can see by combining different strategies. So, the basic stuff, lighting, the plug loads we talked about, the retro commissioning, things like that, when you're doing those, in like common areas or tenant areas, you're talking about like 10%-ish reductions in your energy use, which is great. If you want to, get even more, when you start to combine those simple retrofits in both common areas and tenant areas, that can be a powerful way to, increase the reduction. Or if you start looking at some of the bigger retrofits, like some of the HVAC equipment and things like that in a common area or in tenant areas, you can start to, move the needle more and, be in that 10 to 20% range. And then if you want to really make a big impact, starting to combine it all together, and even adding in things like the renewables and energy storage that we've talked about, you're starting to get big reductions beyond 20% of the energy use that you either have or would have if it was a new building, comparing between that and what it would have been built otherwise. So the last slide I have here, as far as DRI goes and decarbonization within the program, I think, people are probably thinking, well, which upgrade should I pick? What should I do? And I've outlined here just some basic thoughts for the different compliance paths. The thing is that, it's not like there's like a prescribed set of strategies or solutions that everyone should follow. Every building's different, and there's flexibility to decide, what's right. And we talked about that even in the slide where we looked at, energy assessments and modeling and cost benefit analysis. The whole point of it is to weigh the different options, the different strategies, and see which ones, work best for your building and the way it operates. For New York Stretch, if you're following the prescriptive path of it, which, specifies certain things that you need to do, then really it means doing whatever measures meet, the prescribed things under that code. If you're doing the performance path, then you get to sort of pick which measures, and it's more that you're trying to hit a reduction. So like the slide we just talked about, how to combine things to achieve different levels of energy reduction, and it's looking at doing those combinations to hit the target you need for that performance path on New York Stretch. Same idea for Energy Star for Path 2, right? It's not like it's specifying a certain measure. It's more that you need to combine and stack them together to be able to get to that score of 90. And in some ways, maybe it's a little trial and error where you'd have to combine some measures, do some simulation to figure out what your energy use would look like and run Target Finder, which fortunately is pretty easy. And see what kind of score you get. But it's the higher reduction you're getting, the higher your score, basically. So stacking together what you need to get to that, and then third party, that's just going to totally depend on the certification program. But many of them have requirements for different kinds of like efficient systems and things like that. And so making sure that you're doing the ones that get you the points that you need for the certification path that you're choosing. So with that, we can open it up for some questions. I think we got a little over 10 minutes left. Hopefully it was informative, and look forward to answering some questions from folks.
Thanks, Michael. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you're more than welcome to put it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and then we'll unmute you. One thing I do want to just note is that as the New York Forward or DRI planning process progresses in your community, there will be an opportunity to learn a little bit more, particularly about the compliance requirements that go forward, and to get a little bit more individualized assistance if that's something you're interested in. Okay, Rebecca, you got your hand up, and I'm going to unmute you. Yep. Hi, Rebecca.
Yep.
Hey, hi. Thanks so much for this really comprehensive presentation. I just have a couple of minor, maybe clarifications. The heat pump on top of the hot water heater is something I'd never seen before. Is that what that is, a retrofit on top of an existing hot water heater?
No. That's like,
That's an entirely different hot water heater.
Right. Yeah, like at this point, I think you can even go to like Home Depot and Lowe's and even find some there. But yeah, you'd replace like the entire existing water heater tank and all.
Got it.
And then the new one comes with like a combined unit of a tank and a heat pump.
So it's something to think about if your current hot water heater is aging and you need to replace it. This would be the way to go when you replace it, if you have the space and the ventilation, as you said.
Right.
The other question I wanted to ask is, we have maybe you're not going to answer this right now because, as you said, there's going to be a lot of work to do in the coming months with the DRI, but we have a 1998 oil burning boiler that's reaching the end of its life. And we have already started working with a geothermal contractor to get some sense of the feasibility to transition the entire building to geothermal. And it seems to be very feasible. In fact, the next door neighbor already has it. And we therefore are kind of skipping over the energy audit for the moment, although this was a good reminder to go back and do a complete energy audit, because we want to focus on replacing that heating and system. We don't have cooling, we don't have dehumidification, we just have heating. It's expensive. It doesn't work super well. So I just wanted to make the comment that the energy, is there any reason why we could do an energy audit while we're thinking about doing the geothermal system, I guess, but.
Yeah, I would still encourage you to do it because, I showed kind of the path, the 1 through 7, right?
Yeah.
But some of the idea, even, thinking about a geothermal system, those can be more costly because of like the drilling or the trenching, depending on what kind of system it is. If you went through and did an audit and found that you could reduce the overall like heating and cooling load, you might even be able to downsize the geothermal system where like you need one less trench or one less borehole or whatever, right? And that could save some cost on the system itself.
Yeah. Great. That's a great, okay, that's good. That's all I need to know for now. That's a very strong reason why we should do an energy audit as we're developing the funding for whatever comes after the boiler. The other thing I wanted to ask about is, this is a 1910 era building, slate roof, historic brick, leaded glass windows. So some of the load reduction strategies, which are very familiar to me for my home, don't seem like they'd be relevant or feasible in a building of that age. Are there different strategies that you can suggest for a building, for a historic building that has those limitations?
Yeah.
You can't do a cool roof when you have a slate roof.
Right.
Right? And air sealing is really a problem if you have a big 2-foot wide stone foundation.
Right.
That the building's sitting on. And I don't know where we'd fit insulation given that the entire basement is already built out. I mean, we'd be talking about taking off the walls or something. I don't know. So it just seems very limited for certain buildings.
It is, and especially with historic buildings, if that, is in there, it can be really challenging. I know, there are some ways to like add insulation, even with walls where, you can essentially drill a hole and blow insulation in, and it can be time consuming and a lot of effort because you essentially go, well, if you've got like, studs or fern or whatever, you like go between, right? And you got to drill a hole and fill each cavity one at a time. But it can be a way to do it. Spray insulation is, I don't know, there are differing opinions about it for, interior of masonry and whatnot. It does, provide an option, depending on the construction of the building. One of the interesting things we talked about, I had the slide about thermal storage, and that was really thinking about, in a sense, water tanks or maybe like chilled ice. But I have seen for older buildings that are heavy masonry construction or stone, where you could look at actually using the building itself and the mass of the building as, in a sense, a form of thermal storage. I remember seeing one. It was an old church in, I think, San Francisco, and they had the luxury of time and whatever, and so they had like collected data for like a year or something. But they basically found that because of the masonry, stone structure, it kept a pretty stable temperature, and they could, in many of the seasons, shut off the HVAC and just let the building essentially, keep its own temperature. And that, with their HVAC system, they were like fighting against the building. So they, you'd like cool it all day long, and then it would, absorb all of it. And then at night, they were like heating the building to make up for it. It's like if they just kind of left it alone, it actually did okay. So, it's an interesting thing. It's one you'd have to like study specific for the building and, like how it's constructed or whatever. But it's another idea of like how you could save some energy and not spend as much on heating and cooling and stuff.
Well, thank you very much. Those were my questions. Very helpful. Yeah. I'm going to need to jump off the webinar, but I really appreciate this.
Sure.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Bye-bye.
All right, let's leave it for another few seconds. I don't see any other hands raised, and nothing else in the chat. Okay. So as I said, if you have questions as you're going through the initial development of your project related to decarbonization, please reach out to the planning consultant for your community as well as the DOS project manager. And then there will be, as we said earlier, additional opportunities to kind of learn a little bit more about decarbonization and the requirements later in the process. But other than that, thank you all so much for attending, and we will be sending out the slide deck to all of the attendees today, as well as making the recording available in the future. All right, thank you all very much and have a good rest of your day.